Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into a case that I know a lot of you have been asking about, the San Antonio Strangler, Johnny Joe Avalos.
Yeah.
We have some excerpts from his Wikipedia article. We're going to try to do a deep dive on this case, see if we can figure out a little more about him, maybe his crimes and what happened.
Um, this is a case that really speaks to a larger trend that we see with serial killers, which is that they often target people who are, I guess you could say, marginalized, overlooked by society.
Yeah.
Sex workers, runaways, homeless people. These are people whose disappearances may not immediately raise red flags, which makes them very vulnerable.
It's kind of a chilling thought, right? I mean, is it a systemic failure that allows predators to exploit these vulnerabilities?
Absolutely. Think about it like in this case, Avalos's victims were mainly sex workers.
Yeah.
And there's so much stigma surrounding sex work that it makes it really hard for these women to go to the police or seek help when they're victims of crime.
Right.
They're more worried about being judged than they are about getting justice.
So they're stuck in a system that, like, silences them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes them really easy targets.
Yeah, scary. So who was this guy, Johnny Joe Avalos, before he became known as the San Antonio Strangler?
Well, according to what we have, he was born in 1986, and he spent most of his life on the south side of San Antonio. He worked as a dishwasher.
Oh, okay.
He had an intellectual disability, and he had a history of some run-ins with the law. We're talking things like terroristic threats,
Oh, wow.
criminal mischief, drug possession.
So, I mean, kind of sounds like he was living this double life.
Right. On the surface, just a regular guy, but underneath, something much darker was happening. And then between 2012 and 2015, that darkness, it really exploded. He murdered 4 women and a teenage girl.
Wow.
And his methods were brutal. Rape, sometimes robbery. And he would strangle his victims, a lot of times with his bare hands or using plastic bags.
It's just awful. And what's even more disturbing is that he claimed to have even more victims. Like, I think at least 20 more who got away, although there's really no proof to back that up.
Yeah, that's one of the things we have to be really careful about in cases like this, separating the facts from the boasts. I mean, it's possible there are more victims, but we can only go with what's been verified.
Right. Makes sense. So let's focus on the victims we know about for sure. The article mentions a few key cases. Let's start with Vanessa Lopez. She was, I think, the first one.
Right, Vanessa Lopez. Her body was found in the San Antonio River in 2012. And tragically, her death and the deaths of 5 other women found around the same time were initially ruled as undetermined.
Oh, wow.
This wasn't uncommon back then, especially when you were dealing with victims who were, maybe living on the edges of society.
You know, when I read that, it made me think, were there any missed opportunities here? Maybe even some bias that slowed down the investigation early on?
It's definitely something to think about. We tend to focus on what the killer did, but it's just as important to ask if the system that's supposed to protect people was working the way it should have. It wasn't until Avalos was linked to other murders that investigators started taking a closer look at these earlier cases.
Okay, that's interesting. So one of these really important cases was the murder of Natalie Chavez in 2014, I think. She was a 15-year-old runaway.
Yeah, Natalie's case was a turning point. Her body was found dumped under a bridge, and eventually DNA evidence tied Avalos to the crime. But it wasn't a quick connection. So it does make you wonder, could something have been done differently? Could a life have been saved if things had moved faster?
Yeah, that's always the question, right? In these cases, you always kind of wonder if things had been done differently. Speaking of DNA evidence, I'm curious about the technology back then. Was DNA analysis as advanced in 2014 as it is today?
Good question. It's amazing how much forensic science has changed, even just in the last decade or so. The methods they had in 2014 were different, often less sensitive, less efficient than what we have now.
So it's possible that the DNA they collected back then, if they looked at it again with today's technology, it could reveal new clues that were missed before.
Very possible. As DNA technology has gotten better, we can now extract and analyze even tiny bits of genetic material. So samples that might have been useless in 2014 could be really helpful now.
That's fascinating. It's like looking at old evidence with a brand new set of eyes. You start to see things you couldn't see before. Who knows how many cold cases could be solved with the tools we have now?
It's definitely something to think about. Forensic science is always moving forward, and it's giving us more ways to solve crimes and bring justice to victims and their families. In Avalos' case, it was those advances in DNA technology that really helped connect him to his crimes.
I guess it shows that sometimes justice can be delayed but not denied. It just takes time for the science to catch up. So Natalie Chavez's case was a big turning point, the first time DNA linked Avalos to the crime scene. But it wasn't the last. In 2015, there were two more brutal murders, Rosemary Perez and Genevieve Ramirez.
Rosemary Perez was found strangled to death, wrapped in a sheet. And a few months later, Genevieve Ramirez was discovered unconscious in an alley. She had been badly beaten and strangled and was naked from the waist down. Tragically, she died 2 months later from her injuries.
Two more lives just brutally cut short. It feels like there's this pattern here, this escalation of violence, like he was getting more confident, bolder in his attacks.
Yeah, that's a chilling, but unfortunately a pretty common thing we see with serial killers. The more they get away with, the more confident, even reckless they become. The violence gets worse, the risks they take increase.
It's terrifying to think about a predator like that, just growing more sure of himself with every attack, the danger to potential victims just multiplying.
Exactly. And sadly, this pattern led to the death of Celia Lopez, Avalos's last victim. Her body was found decomposed, with signs of trauma to her head and face.
God, it's heartbreaking. I can't even imagine what she went through.
It's a brutal reminder of the kind of violence we're talking about here. And it was with Celia Lopez's murder that the pieces of the puzzle really started to fall into place. Men's underwear found near her body contained Avalos's DNA, and combined with the DNA from Natalie Chavez's case, this was the breakthrough investigators have been waiting for.
It's this constant race against time. Forensic evidence is being gathered bit by bit, but at the same time, the threat to innocent lives is growing every day. Luckily, in this case, the science caught up just in time.
Absolutely. It was a huge turning point. It wasn't just about individual pieces of evidence, but how all those pieces fit together to create this clear and incriminating picture.
Like putting together a mosaic. Each piece might seem small and insignificant on its own, but put them all together and you get a clear picture. And in this case, the picture was Johnny Avalos, the San Antonio Strangler.
Exactly. And with that picture came the possibility of finally bringing him to justice. It's interesting, though, one of the things that made it easier for Avalos to commit these crimes was his appearance. He didn't really fit the stereotype of what people think of as a serial killer. He had a job, he seemed to have a stable life, he blended in.
It's chilling to think about that. A predator just hiding in plain sight, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. It makes you question everything you think you know about who's dangerous and who's not.
Exactly. And that's where the forensic evidence becomes so crucial. When you're dealing with someone who doesn't fit the profile, it's often the science that reveals the truth.
So in a way, Avalos's ability to blend in actually made the forensic science even more important in catching him. It's a great example of how science can cut through deception and get to the truth, no matter how well it's hidden.
Absolutely. It highlights the dedication of the investigators who work so hard to piece together this puzzle, often with limited resources and constantly evolving technology.
Speaking of the investigators, I've always wondered what it's like for them working on cases like this. It must be incredibly emotionally draining, knowing there's a predator out there, possibly hurting more people while they're trying to connect the dots.
That's a side of forensic work we don't talk about enough, the emotional toll it takes on the people who have to deal with the darkest parts of humanity day in and day out. Can you imagine the pressure, the knowledge that every minute counts, the constant awareness that lives are at stake?
It's got to be a heavy burden. I mean, it makes their success in catching Avalos even more remarkable. So how did they finally catch him?
The break in the case came in April 2015 when Avalos was arrested for sexually assaulting a minor.
Okay.
And it turned out this assault was connected to the murder of Natalie Chavez.
So even though they suspected him in Natalie's death, they didn't have enough to actually charge him with murder at that point.
Right. They had their suspicions, but not enough solid evidence. This arrest, though, it gave them the opportunity to start building a stronger case.
It's like a domino effect. One event leads to another, and eventually, justice is served.
Exactly. And when they questioned Avalos about the assault, he claimed that he'd paid Natalie for sex and didn't know how old she really was. It was a pretty desperate attempt to downplay what he'd done.
Classic manipulation tactic.
Yeah.
Shift the blame, minimize the offense, anything to avoid taking responsibility.
Yeah. But the investigators weren't buying it. They kept pressing him, pointing out the inconsistencies in his story, and finally, he admitted that he knew she was underage.
That speaks to their skill as interviewers, being able to read people, to see through the lies and get to the truth.
Absolutely. They never gave up on finding justice for Natalie Chavez and the other victims, and eventually their hard work paid off. As more evidence came in, they were able to charge Avalos with the murders of Chavez, Perez, Ramirez, and Celia Lopez.
It's a good reminder that even when the road to justice is long and complicated, persistence can win out in the end. But it did take a while to connect all the pieces. Avalos wasn't actually linked to Vanessa Lopez's murder until a year later, right? Bringing the total number of confirmed victims to 5.
That's right. It was a complex investigation spanning several years and involving multiple victims. They had to examine the evidence carefully, analyze every detail, and be willing to reevaluate their assumptions as new information came to light.
It goes to show that justice may not always be swift, but the pursuit of it should never stop.
I agree. And I think this case really underlines the vulnerability of certain groups in our society. The fact that it took so long to connect Avalos to Vanessa Lopez's murder says a lot about how often society overlooks and undervalues the lives of people who are marginalized.
It's a sad truth, and one we need to address. Why are these groups so vulnerable? What are the systemic failures that allow them to be exploited, and what can we do to better protect them?
Those are important questions, and they're ones we as a society need to be asking ourselves.
Okay, so we've talked about Avalos's crimes and how he was caught. Let's move on to the trial and the outcome.
So in 2016, Avalos was indicted on capital murder charges.
Yeah.
However, because of his intellectual disability, he was found ineligible for the death penalty under what's known as the Atkins standard.
That brings up a really complicated issue. How much did Avalos's intellectual disability impact the investigation, and how the prosecution handled the case?
It was a major factor throughout the entire legal process. For starters, it played a key role in the decision not to pursue the death penalty. The legal and ethical implications of executing someone with an intellectual disability are huge, and this case clearly fell into the protections of the Atkins standard.
That makes sense legally, but it does add another layer of complexity. How do you balance the pursuit of justice for the victims with the understanding that someone with an intellectual disability might not fully grasp the consequences of their actions?
It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers. It requires a very nuanced approach, carefully weighing the severity of the crime against the individual's ability to understand what they did.
It's about recognizing that justice can have many different forms. In Avalos's case, it seems like the court tried to find a punishment that acknowledged the seriousness of his crimes while also taking into account his limited understanding.
Exactly. And that ultimately led to his plea deal in 2019. Avalos pleaded guilty to all 5 murders and received 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole.
So even though the death penalty was off the table, he'll still spend the rest of his life behind bars. That's a serious punishment that ensures he can't hurt anyone else, while also acknowledging his reduced capacity for understanding.
Exactly. It was a delicate balancing act, but I think the outcome in Avalos's case represents a thoughtful effort to address the complexities of this particular situation.
It reminds us that the legal system, while not perfect, aims to be more than just punitive. It also tries to understand, to weigh different factors, and to arrive at a judgment that truly reflects justice.
Well said. And we can't forget that even with a conviction and a sentence, the impact of these crimes doesn't just disappear. The victims' families will always carry the pain of their loss, the community grapples with the trauma, and the effects of Avalos's actions continue to be felt long after the legal proceedings are over.
It's a reminder that while justice is crucial, it can't erase the pain or undo the damage. It's a step toward healing, a recognition of what was done wrong, but the scars remain.
You've hit on a crucial point. Justice is a complex and multifaceted concept. It's not just about punishment. It's also about accountability, rehabilitation, and ultimately working towards a safer and more just society for everyone.
It's a journey, not a destination. And while the legal system is an essential part of that journey, it's only one piece of a much bigger picture.
Absolutely. We need to be addressing the systemic problems that contribute to the vulnerability of certain groups, promoting empathy and understanding, and encouraging restorative justice practices. These are all vital parts of a holistic approach to justice.
I think that's a really powerful message to keep in mind as we wrap up our look at the Johnny Avalos case.
Indeed. The journey toward understanding and achieving justice is an ongoing one.
You know, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Johnny Avalos case, I keep thinking about the 5 lives lost, all the people who were traumatized by his actions. It makes you realize that justice, even when it's served, can't really heal all the pain.
Yeah, you're right. The impact of crimes like these goes way beyond the courtroom. It affects families, entire communities, even people who weren't directly involved.
It's a lot to process, you know? And Avalos's intellectual disability adds this whole other layer of complexity to an already tragic story. It's something people have a lot of different opinions about. Some say focusing on his disability downplays the seriousness of his crimes, while others believe it's important to be compassionate and understanding. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that debate really reflects a fundamental conflict in our justice system, this tension between accountability and compassion. We want justice for the victims, acknowledgement of the harm they suffered. But at the same time, we try to consider the perpetrator's individual circumstances, recognizing that things like intellectual disabilities can influence their behavior and their level of responsibility.
So it's not about excusing what they did, but trying to understand the context.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the humanity of everyone involved, both the victims and the person who committed the crimes. It's about acknowledging the tragedy of the lives lost, but also considering the complexities of human behavior, how people are shaped by their experiences, and the challenges of navigating the world with different levels of understanding.
That brings us back to how Avalos's intellectual disability affected the investigation and the prosecution's approach.
Right, it was a big factor right from the start. Investigators had to be mindful of his ability to understand their questions, to give them accurate information. Prosecutors had to figure out how his disability might affect his legal defense and what that meant for the trial's outcome.
And as we discussed earlier, it was a major reason why they decided not to seek the death penalty.
Absolutely. The Atkins standard, which prevents the execution of people with intellectual disabilities, recognizes that they might be less culpable for their actions. It basically says that the most extreme punishment might not be right when someone's understanding of what they did is compromised.
It's a really complex issue, from both a legal and ethical standpoint. And it makes you wonder, what does justice really mean in these cases? If the death penalty isn't an option, what other punishments are suitable, considering the severity of the crimes and the fact that the perpetrator might not fully understand what they did?
That's a question that legal experts and policymakers are still grappling with. There's no simple solution, no one answer that fits every situation. Every case has to be looked at individually, taking into account the specific circumstances, the types of crimes committed, the degree of the person's impairment, and their potential for rehabilitation.
It highlights the fact that justice isn't this fixed, unchanging idea. It's an evolving process, constantly changing as we face new challenges and try to build a fairer and more humane society.
Well said. And in Avalos's case, the court ultimately decided that life in prison without parole was the most appropriate punishment.
It's a sentence that reflects how serious his crimes were, while still acknowledging his intellectual disability. It guarantees that he won't be able to hurt anyone else, but it also recognizes the factors that might have contributed to his actions.
It's a tough balance to find, but I think the decision in this case shows a real effort to deal with all the complexities involved.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. The Johnny Avalos case isn't just a story about a criminal and the people he hurt. It forces us to look at larger societal issues, how vulnerable marginalized groups are, how our justice system handles intellectual disabilities, and the constant struggle to balance holding people accountable with showing compassion. It's a case that asks us to ask hard questions, to face uncomfortable truths, and to work towards creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
I couldn't have said it better myself. The search for justice is a journey we're all on together, and the Avalos case gives us valuable insights into how complicated and challenging that journey can be. Hopefully it inspires us to keep trying to understand, to challenge our own assumptions, and to strive for a future where every single life is valued and protected.
And on that note, we'll conclude our deep dive. Thank you all for listening. As always, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving for a deeper understanding of the world around us.